Claire Curran.
Mr Chair, this minister does not understand her own bill, does not understand the impact of it, or she's got her fingers in her ears. And just to talk about the response from industry, NZ Rise is a credible organisation which represents New Zealand tech-based industries, New Zealand Kiwi companies. Google, Facebook, Yahoo, Microsoft represent a group of international service providers who are also, all of them are actively opposing the key measures in this bill which we are talking about today. What they say is that as currently drafted, this bill would impose, and this is in part 2, Mr Chair, a duty to assist on service providers and empower the government to impose additional, not what the minister just said, but additional interception obligations on a service provider by deeming them in to be a network operator for certain purposes. That is the difference in this part of the bill. Section 35 of this part of the bill provides unprecedented powers to a minister to decide whether a service provider, which is the over-the-top providers such as the Googles or the Facebooks, etc., can be deemed in to become a network operator. In other words, they get treated just the same as those organisations such as the telcos in Part 3 of this bill. It's the minister who gets to decide that on the recommendation of the GCSB with no checks and balances. And that is what is the issue in this bill, is that there are not the checks and balances. There is a shadowy situation being set up for recommendations to be made on national security, including something called economic well-being, which is not defined, and huge powers, discretionary powers, being given to a minister to make those decisions. This is not the New Zealand way of doing things. The New Zealand way of doing things is where you put into legislation measures that ensure that dodgy decisions can't be made. We have no guarantee in this legislation that a minister, based on a recommendation that cannot be made public, cannot make a decision that is questionable, and it cannot be challenged, or if it is challenged, it's through a judicial review. The big issue for the New Zealand-based companies is that the smaller tech-based companies, such as our emerging innovative companies, are concerned they are going to get caught up in this legislation and be caught up and being defined as like the traditional telcos are. And they do not have the resources. They do not have the resources or the means to question or to provide a pushback, or to have the kind of dialogue that may need to be had, that their big brother organisations such as the telecoms, the Vodafones, etc. of the world could do. They don't have the means to do that, and so there is no check and balance for them. And those are the New Zealand tech-based companies, and they have written as a group, as every member of Parliament in this House will have received in the last few days, a letter saying, please do not broaden the definition of network operator in this legislation to include us. The Minister shakes her head. The Minister shakes her head.
Show me the word.
Well, Minister, you've heard it. You've heard it said, because there are cross references in this legislation to definitions that do provide an enormous encompassing. Yes, they do. Yes, they do. So everybody else, as with the GCSB legislation, everybody else in the country is wrong except for the Minister. Is that right? Everybody else in the country is wrong. Well, and yet the evidence could not be given to the Select Committee on these matters properly. The Minister referenced tens of millions of dollars that are somehow going to be saved. In the regulatory impact statements provided on this legislation, all of that information was redacted. We weren't allowed to hear that information, Mr Chair.
Claire Curran.
Thank you. In the first version of the bill, clause 24(6) would have extended the application of the duty to assist to global service providers. This was a hotly debated part of the bill, and it was clearly an issue. And eventually there was a decision to delete that clause, which would have helped. But the fact is that along with that went an expanding of the definition of what a service provider was, which meant that that conflict in international law that we have talked about several times tonight in this debate has been expanded. So every time the word service provider appears in this piece of legislation, it means any person from within or outside New Zealand who provides or makes available in New Zealand a telecommunications service to an end user, whether or not as part of a business undertaking and regardless of the nature of that business undertaking, but does not include a network operator. So that is the difference between the two definitions. But the fact is it's still an extremely broad definition, and clause 35 of this bill means that the Minister, on the recommendation of the GCSB, without a check and balance, can deem in one of those service providers and make them a network operator. Now, you deny in this House tonight, Minister, that that's wrong, a wrong interpretation. That's a true interpretation. So that gives the Minister enormous, unprecedented powers. How are those powers reflected in the existing legislation? This is a new provision, and it's a provision which has been hotly contested by, as I've said, the international organisations, the Googles, Facebooks, Yahoos and Microsofts of the world, who argue that this puts them in direct a conflict of law, which makes our law look very foolish to the rest of the world, and for the New Zealand-based tech companies puts enormous, that definition of network operator draws them in a way that is unprecedented in terms of the potential conditions that are going to be imposed on them by surveillance agencies, and which will be stifling of innovation in this country, because there is what is missing is a check and balance from another entity that provides some balance and provides some good advice to the Minister, and recourse from those smaller companies in terms of pushing back against those decisions over which they have no control. And I'd like the Minister to get up again and tell me how those organisations are supposed to operate under this legislation as it is put before us tonight.
Stephen Browning.
Chair, rise to speak to Part 2 of the bill, of the Telecommunications, Interception, Capability and Security Bill. This interception capability, again, is this part of the same problem we talked about in Part 1, whereas we have to ask, where were the instructions for New Zealand to go down this